Welcome to Tales from the Fireside by RODEAX and Dan Lee, a collection of grim tales to light your way through the long dark of winter.
I wondered if you would be joining us tonight. Well, don't just stand there. Close the door, shut out the bitter cold. Come, sit, for the story is just about to begin.
The house was quiet now that the children had left. So comfortable Abigail had become with the spirited sounds of their play. The way they would run through the house, startling the cat and bounding up the stairs two at a time, their impish laughter audible wherever you stood beneath that roof. The first weekend they went away, she had cried and cried in the armchair in the corner of the living room. But now, of course, she was a seasoned veteran of letting them go. Besides, it was just for the weekend, wasn't it? It didn't matter that Abigail worked almost exactly the same hours as her ex-husband, and that without the weekend she had very little time of her own to spend with the children. It didn't matter, did it? She was the bigger person. The wind gusted nonchalantly between the trees in the yard, almost as if it was telling Abigail that no one cared for her problems. So she sighed heavily and continued to pick up the children's toys. Lisa had abandoned the guests at her tea party, and now Raggedy Ann flopped drunkenly onto the shoulder of Bramble Bear, who at some point had kicked over the teapot. Charlie had left his Matchbox cars in traffic jams across the carpet, and as Abigail stooped to pick up Bramble Bear and tuck him beneath her arm, she inevitably stepped on a Mini Cooper, causing it to roll, writing it off completely. "Fire truck," uttered Abigail, dropping Bramble Bear. Then she realised that the children weren't there, and she could have said a real swear word if she'd wanted. She rubbed the aching sole of her bare foot and cursed the little car. Then she laughed ruefully at herself and continued to pick up the toys alone. It wasn't long that her marriage had ended, and since she had given up work for the past 8 years, Abigail was quite understandably struggling to slot back into the habits of normal, everyday people. It angered her that for 8 years she had been the mother machine, only to have the weekend snatched away from her. Of course she loved the children, and of course she had adored spending time with them, being there when they finished school, helping them with their homework, playing with them and laughing with them. Jack had told her that it would be good for her having the weekends to herself, and of course to the solicitors that had sounded inscrutably reasonable. They didn't see the cruel twitch of his upper lip and the sarcastic glint in his eye. Jack was the sane, sensible one, and she was his crazy ex-wife, and that was just how it was going to be. Finally, day waned into evening, and Abigail, alone in her tidy house, set about making some dinner. Rat-a-tat-tat. There was someone at the door, which struck Abigail as very strange. She rarely had visitors, and there was a sign in the window meant to deter salesmen and Jehovah's Witnesses. Nevertheless, she left the stove and went to the door. It was already dark outside, and winter's chill had set in, so when Abigail peered through the window pane, all she could see was her own reflection and the faintly glistening crystals that had grown on the surface of the glass. She opened the door, expecting a neighbour or even the children come home early telling tales of a negligent father. But there, on the doorstep, stood a stranger. He was dressed plainly, a long overcoat and a dark brown hat, the rim pulled low over his face. Perhaps it was just to shelter him from the cruel weather. Abigail could make out a little smile playing on the man's lips, just visible in the gloom. She was about to ask him what he wanted of her, when she caught sight of the case in his hand. Of course. She sighed internally. "I'm sorry, but I don't buy from salesmen at the door," said Abigail firmly. But the man just smiled even more. "Oh, I'm not here to sell to you," he said, raising his head to finally reveal the face from beneath his hat. Abigail was startled by the blue of his eyes, like the coldest daggers piercing the skin, yet somehow a welcome feeling. "I'm not here to sell," continued the stranger, "nor to buy." His smile grew, and Abigail, puzzled and caught completely off guard, did not quite know how to reply. "I'm here to play a game," said the man. Finally, Abigail found it in herself to respond. "A game?" she asked. "What kind of game?" "A game of chance," replied the stranger. "Why would you come to my house to play a game with me?" asked Abigail, never breaking the man's magnetic gaze. He laughed, and somehow the sound was like ice water trickling down her spine. "Abigail, said the man with mirth. "Where else would I go to play a game with you?" Abigail frowned, suddenly noticing the chill of the evening. "Did you just—" she began. It was far too absurd. He couldn't have. Could he? "What is it?" said the stranger, his voice a soothing purr. "Nothing. I just thought—" stumbled Abigail. "Never mind." The stranger smiled again. "Good. Would you like to play?" Abigail considered it. Of course, it was bad practice to let strange men into your house at night. But she could handle herself. She was a grown-up after all. And hadn't Jack wanted her to have more of a social life? She pictured Jack dropping the kids off, met by a handsome stranger standing in the home he left behind. This man was far more attractive than Jack, and Abigail found herself coveting the idea of Jack's jealousy. Yes, if you never talked to strangers, you'd never make friends at all, would you? So Abigail smiled and opened the door wide. "I'd be delighted to play your game," she said, and invited the stranger inside. "What a lovely home you have," said the man, stepping into the hall. Now that he was inside, Abigail was surprised to note how tall he was. It was almost as if the rooms were too small for him, and he would surely have to stoop to pass through doorways. "Thank you," said Abigail, flattered by the stranger. "Is it just you here, on your own?" asked the man, as Abigail shut the door behind him. "Usually I have my children with me," replied Abigail, "but they're with their father at weekends." The man nodded, unspeaking, as if he was acknowledging the heartache and trauma that had befallen the household. "You must be a wonderful mother," said the man gently, and something in his voice sounded as if he knew. "Thank you," said Abigail, taking the man's coat. His flattery was almost overwhelming. "People like you deserve not to be lonely," he said, and Abigail, hanging his coat on the stand beside the door, was suddenly abashed. "Oh, I'm not lonely," she gushed, taking his hat and hanging it with the coat. He lowered his chin and peered at her, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Abigail," he purred, "you don't need to hide from me." His gaze was magnetic, and although he was a stranger, Abigail suddenly felt a flush fill her cheeks, and a crimson warmth made its way inside her. Then something on the stove bubbled over and hissed piercingly as it sizzled on the hob. "Oh," started Abigail. "I'm sorry, I was cooking dinner." She rushed into the kitchen and stirred the pot with a wooden spoon. The man followed her slowly into the room, that knowing smile ever playing on his lips. "Would you like some?" she asked. "Please," he replied. Now that he was inside, in the light, Abigail could see the sculpted beauty of his features. He was almost angelic, the way his skin caught the light, like marble, and the fine structure of the bones beneath his surface. He caught her looking, and almost blushing, Abigail looked away. It was strange. His skin was flawless, like that of a child, and yet the way he moved, the way he spoke, the deepness of his gaze possessed the quality of someone far, far older than he could possibly be. How old was he? 40? 45? It was difficult to tell. He amused himself by stirring the sauce as Abigail strained the pasta. "The dining room's through there," she said, and pointed him through the doorway. As she followed him out of the kitchen, carrying 2 plates in her hands, a flickering light reflected off of the walls, and as she emerged into the room behind him, she saw that the 2 dining candles were already lit. "How did you—" she began, but the man just smiled, and she realized that he must have snuck off to light them while she was stirring the sauce. He poured the wine, and they sat together and ate by candlelight. At first, Abigail had tried to fill the silence with details about her life, where she grew up, what her siblings were doing, how Lisa and Charlie were doing in school. But quickly her noise petered out, and a juicy silence swelled around them. Talking seemed futile. Something in the stranger's gaze seemed so knowing, as if he already understood her life better than she did herself. But the silence was good. Not comfortable, but uncertain. Full of mystery and questions unanswered. This was a silence that could go anywhere. The still air was rich with potential. They finished their meal, and to her surprise, the stranger stood up and cleared the plates away. She was stirred by his chivalry, and once again that delicious crimson warmth made its way inside of her. He returned with a telltale glint in his eye. "So," he said, "about this game." "Yes," said Abigail, a little disappointed to recall the purpose of the stranger's visit. "How do we play?" Now the man's face ripened into a cunning smile. "Let me show you," said the man, and set his case upon the table. It occurred to Abigail that she couldn't recall him bringing the case in from the hall, but she pushed the thought aside, ignoring the shuddering sensation that prickled on her skin and the unease that writhed about in her insides like a serpent. There was nothing amiss with this handsome stranger. Surely she was only nervous because of the stories that made the news, acid attacks and home invasions. But this beautiful man was far too chivalrous. He was a gentleman. So she swallowed up her worries and leaned in as the stranger sat down and one by one unfastened the clasps of his case. Click, click, and the case opened. No sooner were the clasps undone, but the lid of the case began to rise in one deathly smooth arc, as if of its own volition. Abigail's eyes widened. It must have been one of those fancy air pressure things. Perhaps the stranger was not only handsome, but wealthy too. His ice-blue eyes smiled at Abigail over the lid of the case as he deftly navigated the objects inside. Onto the table, the stranger placed one small glass vial. The glass was almost phosphorescent and set in the deepest shade of violet. It seemed to hum luxuriantly with its own internal light, an object of almost impossible beauty. Abigail glanced up and caught the stranger studying her, that knowing smile ever playing on his lips. "Go on," he said. "Take it. Feel its weight in your hands." And Abigail complied. She held her breath as she took the vial in her fingertips. It couldn't have weighed more than a feather. "It's so light," thought Abigail. "Isn't it?" agreed the man, and took the vial from her hands. "Do you know what it is?" he asked. Abigail shook her head, entranced by the arcane glow. "It's a human soul," said the man. Abigail dragged her eyes away from the vial and met the stranger's arresting gaze. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. Surely he was joking. So his sense of humour might be a little strange. He was still devastatingly handsome. "Oh, I'm deadly serious," said the stranger. "I'm afraid I never joke." The man's eyes glistened, and his knowing smile had transposed into amusement. Abigail could swear that he was laughing at her, making fun of her in some way, some secret joke that he wasn't willing to share. "I told you, I never joke," said the man. "I don't like the way you're looking at me," uttered Abigail, and the man's smile fell. "Oh, Abigail," crooned the stranger, his unsmiling face a mask of occult secrecy. His voice was magnetic and soothing, but suddenly Abigail could hear the deathly sharpness of its edge. "How do you know my name?" she demanded. "Why, you told me," he said. "Don't you remember?" "No, I don't," said Abigail. "I'd like you to leave now." "But we haven't played my game," he purred, his voice a velvet dagger. "I don't want to play any more," she said, unable to mask the quiver in her tone. "I'd like you to leave." Abigail rose to show the man the door. "Sit down, Abigail," said the man. Ice pierced her skin. "No," she whispered. "I want you to leave." "Then you shouldn't have invited me in," said the man, his eyes flashing dangerously. All of a sudden, Abigail felt her knees buckle, and as she dropped, her chair lurched inwards, catching her and slamming her back to her place at the table. Abigail stared at the stranger, the light of the candles dancing on his marble skin and accentuating the hollows of his cheeks. "Now," he said, "shall we play?" Abigail remained speechless, regarding him in the watchful way a rabbit might eye a fox. "Oh, don't worry," continued the stranger. "If you win, I'll leave you be." Abigail continued to stare. "If you win, you may never see me again," teased the man in that dangerous, illustrious voice. "And if I lose?" asked Abigail. And the man just smiled. Out of the case he brought a second vial, but this time it did not shine. It did not glow with veiled beauty. It was dull, empty. He placed it on the table in front of Abigail, and as before she picked it up with care. But this time she did not marvel at the lightness of the vial. Instead, she was startled by its weight. She met the man's mocking gaze and placed the vial on the table. Fine. If he wanted to play silly games, that would be just fine. She would not be fooled by him. The man's smile broadened. "What's the game?" asked Abigail boldly, and the stranger gratefully obliged. "It's a game of chance," he said. "I will have 3 chances to guess your darkest secret." All the while, his piercing stare never left Abigail's face. If I cannot guess your secret, I will leave your home, and I will not return. It was far too simple. No matter what he said, even if he guessed correctly, Abigail knew that she could simply lie and send him on his way. But if I guess correctly, even if you lie your little heart out, said the man, and he tapped the top of the vial 3 terrible times. Fine, said Abigail. The stranger smiled to himself. My first guess, he mused. When you were a child, you killed your sister's goldfish. You took it out of the bowl, and you watched it flap about, gasping in the air, until it died a slow and frantic death. Abigail was silent. She studied the stranger's face with fear. No, he said, I know that's not it. And once again that terrible smile spread across his face, and Abigail could not help but feel that he was toying with her. My second guess, continued the stranger. You saw a child standing on the platform of a train. He was holding a present, all wrapped up with a bow. Perhaps it was his birthday. Abigail felt his sickness cultivating in the pit of her stomach. His mother left his side for just a moment, just to consult the timetable. She turned her back for no more than a minute, and you pushed the child onto the tracks. Now the stranger was grinning at Abigail, a cracked glint frozen in his eyes. You watched from a distance, he continued, as the mother cried out and a crowd gathered to help them. But the train came too soon. The train came far too soon. Abigail couldn't speak. The man was insane. She had let a stranger into her home, and he was insane. A frightened tear dropped from her eye and traced the contours of her face. Another followed. She cried silently, hardly breathing, and never taking her eyes from the deranged man at her table. Oh, come now, purred the stranger. I know that wasn't you. He breathed in deeply, as if savouring the moment, and leaned back in the chair, stretching his neck from side to side. But you do have a secret, don't you? He said. One guess left. I'd better make it count. He met her eyes once more, fixing her with that horrible, motionless stare. My third guess, uttered the stranger, a sickening gravity to his voice. You drove your husband away. Abigail felt a pang deep in her chest. You drove Jack to leave you, with your nagging and your constant disappointment. He was never good enough, was he? Never good enough for you, and you had to let him know it, didn't you? Now Abigail was weeping freely. Never a kind word for any of his efforts, continued the stranger. No matter what he did, it could never be enough. You even resent the children, don't you? Abigail let out a wrenching sob. You resent them for being of his seed. The stranger's words hung in the air, like tattered memories. Abigail wept. And that's why you took it, said the man. You stole his antique pocket watch, his only family heirloom, and you sold it, keeping the spoils all for yourself. No, whispered Abigail. You let him believe that he'd lost it while he wept and searched the house, said the stranger. It meant so much to him. You of all people knew that. But you sold it, and you didn't even share the rewards with your children. A silence engulfed the dining room, but this time it was not rich and full of potential. It was cold and stagnant and heavy. I'm right, aren't I? Asked the man. I can smell your filthy conscience and all those broken promises. Now the man breathed in deeply, his eyelids fluttering in ecstasy. To me it's like the most sumptuous perfume, he said. I never told a soul, whispered Abigail. The man rose from his seat and stepped towards her silently. Abigail said nothing, shaken by the stranger's words. He wrapped an arm around her shoulder and shushed her like a child. It's okay, he whispered and gently kissed her face. I understand. The kisses felt like butterflies, flutters on her skin, but something in them made Abigail's skin crawl. Please, she uttered, please leave me alone. Oh, but Abigail, said the man, I've won the game, so I'm not going to leave you alone. He took her face firmly in one hand and turned it towards his own. Let me go, she pleaded, trying to push him away, but the stranger only smiled and said, Your wicked soul belongs to me now. He pressed his mouth to hers, and though she fought to push him away, screaming through the pressure of his lips, a terrible, terrible tightness knotted in her chest. It was as if her very insides were tugging to get out. She cried desperately, and through the tears she could see him staring at her with those wild blue hailstones, burning into her and forcing her to look away. The abhorrent knot rose higher in her chest, sending tendrils of pain rippling through her like a terrible cancer. Her insides felt like they had been ensnared, and now, the higher the knot rose, the tighter the ropes pulled, crushing her beating heart further and further to stillness. And then it snapped, like the jolt in your chest when you learn that someone you love is dead. And Abigail was still, and oh so silent. The stranger softly disconnected, letting her mouth slip free of his, and as she rested in the chair, her eyes half closed and her mouth slack, he raised the empty vial to her face and caught the shining whisper that tumbled from her lips, leaving her empty completely. He placed the shimmering vial in the case and sealed both of the clasps. Then, leaving her soulless body, still propped doll-like at the dining table, the stranger left the house and moved silently on to the next town.
We hope you've enjoyed tonight's grisly tale. Please join us next time for another adventure into the dark unknown.
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fireside, written by Rodeo Whiter and Dan Lee, and produced by RODEAX.